Welcome to another installment of Fighting for the Faith. My name is Chris Roseborough. I am your servant in Jesus Christ. This is the channel that compares what people are saying in the name of God to the Word of God. Now, from time to time, we have an opportunity to interview authors, people who are putting books out for the broader body of Christ. And I'm glad today to be able to interview Shane Rosenthal. He has a forthcoming book on Luke's key witness, which will talk about how this type of historical minutia, it might seem like that to some of you, is actually very important for maintaining the veracity of the scriptures and helping us to realize that these are not mythological accounts or legends that have been passed down to us in the Gospels, but these are, in fact, eyewitness testimony. So I'd like to welcome on Fighting for the Faith, Shane Rosenthal. Shane, good to see you, sir.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's been a while since we've seen each other, sir. It was the last time we saw each other down in San Diego. I'm trying to remember.
That's my recollection. Yeah, some kind of an event in somewhere in San Diego, maybe at a church somewhere.
Yeah,
at a function.
Yeah. So you and I have run in similar packs, but in different ends of those packs. So. Now, just for kind of brief history's sake, for a long time you were working with Michael Horton and Rod Rosenblatt and Kim Riddlebarger and the White Horse Inn, and so that is no longer the case, though. So,
yeah, I spent many years trying to herd cats, theologians, but it's harder actually than herding cats.
Right, cats they behave much better. So.
That's right. Yeah, I was the producer of the White Horse Inn, I think from 90 to just 2022. I took a little hiatus there and impersonated a high school teacher at a classical school in Pennsylvania for a couple of years. But for a long time, many decades, I was the producer of the White Horse Inn, hosted the show for a couple of years as well. And just 2022, I started my own podcast called The Humble Skeptic.
There you go. All right. Now, when you were with White Horse Inn, were you there at the very beginning when they were at KKLA? Were you with them?
Yeah. Very beginning, the live days. I helped get the funding to create that show with Mike. And those live days were crazy. I heard from a guy in England who emailed us maybe, 4 years ago. He said, I've been listening to all your shows in the early days. He's riding his bike through England, listening to the shows I produced when I was in college. It kind of blew my mind.
Wow. Yeah. No, out of all of those older shows, the one that always stands out in my mind is the one with Robert Schuller, where he kind of stormed out of the studio, and if any of you can ever get a copy of that, or find a recording,
just go to the White Horse Inn site, type in the name Schuller, and you'll find it. It's like radio theater. Yeah, he got up and walked out. He came back in too. Yeah, and the behind the scenes thing is when he came out of the studio, he was calling for me, like Rosenthal, because he wanted to talk to the producer.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a little more stuff here. You were raised secular Judaism, secular Jew, and how did you? And you were an atheist. How did you make the transition from secular atheist Jew to Bible believing, Bible defending apologist for the Christian faith?
I actually had became an atheist by the third grade. I didn't vocalize my atheism, but I was just going through the motions in Hebrew school, and I was raised in I was actually adopted by a Jewish stepfather. So my mom remarried, and then I become a Rosenthal, and now I'm raised, no more Christmas trees, going to Hebrew schools, preparing for a bar mitzvah. Did get a bar mitzvah, but I really just thought the whole thing was silly. And all these stories in the Bible, they're fantastic and probably made up, but there was no apologetic emphasis in the synagogue. You just taught what to believe, and never any dialogue about theology or apologetics in the home. So A, it wasn't important. B, it was just, here's the claim of what happened, many thousands of years ago. And so I kind of checked out mentally, which is, I think, a really good lesson for churches. Don't merely teach what Christians believe, but also anchor it in the facts of the real world. Super
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
But what happened is, like my first couple of semesters in college, I started talking to people about their, at work, at school, talking about important issues. And I started reading the Bible, and I ran across Micah 5:2. That was the first text that really sort of awakened me. And that's the passage about the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem.
Hmm.
And I'd seen the Christmas specials, so I knew
Right.
that
Right.
this was significant. And so I started talking to rabbis. In the process, I read a lot of messianic prophecies. I found Isaiah 53, Psalm 22,
Hmm.
and I didn't think the rabbis' answers were very good. So
Yeah.
kept reading, kept studying, and I think within 6 months or so, I was baptized as a believing Christian.
Tov Ma'od. That's all I can say about that. So, all right. Okay. So you have a book coming out. And people can actually get a pre-release copy of it right now at thehumbleskeptic.com.
Yep.
But I want to talk about the genre of book that you've written, because I liken it to Bockham's book on Jesus and the eyewitnesses. There's an apologetics lecture I deliver from time to time. In fact, I recently delivered it maybe 2 years ago at a Higher Things conference to a bunch of high school students. And the basic gist of it is that I make the argument that when it comes to the veracity of the claims in the Gospels, the devil isn't in the details, God is in the details. And when we read the Gospel accounts, there is minutia, like legitimate minutia. We learn that there's green grass when Jesus, feeds the 5,000. We know a little bit about the weather. We know about distances to, between different villages and stuff like that. And most importantly, we know the names of villages that don't show up on big maps. And so Bauckham makes a very compelling argument in this book that these details legitimately validate the claims that this is written by an eyewitness. And so you've kind of built off of Bockham's structure, if you would, and now you've written a book about Luke's key witness. And when and it's in a section of scripture, when people read this stuff, their eyes usually glaze over, and they just want to get through it quick because it just is a list of names and things like this. So why are you focusing in on this one key name, and just how important is this Joanna character that you're writing an entire book about?
Well, you just spoiled it. Now people don't have to get the book. I mean, you just told them the name.
Spoiler alert!
Yeah, spoiler alert. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thank you for sort of connecting me to Bauckham. He's definitely one of the scholars that I've appreciated his work a great deal. He wrote a book called Gospel Women, and he has 100 pages on Joanna. I don't know, less than like a decade ago, I read a book by a guy named Ben Witherington. I was preparing to do an interview. I was producing a show where he was going to be featured on the White Horse Inn, and he had a chapter on Joanna, and I'm thinking, he has a whole chapter on this disciple I've never even heard of. Because she's mentioned like twice in the Gospel of Luke and nowhere else. And so she seems to be a rather obscure disciple. Well, that's one of the things, as you mentioned, the detail work is really, that's the kind of thing that Bauckham does. A lot of scholars are doing this kind of work now. Peter J. Williams, in his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Lydia McGrew does this kind of work. A lot of scholars are focusing on kind of like, the way I see it is it's kind of like testing a painting to see whether it's authentic. You don't ask the person. Let's just say, you had a painting passed down through the family, and the family lore is that this painting is actually a lost Monet. And that's the family lore, and you don't know whether that's the case. But once you inherit it, you're going to have to get it appraised. The appraiser will not ask you all the subjective questions. They will ask you, things that they can verify, because they're going to test the canvas. They're going to test the signature. They're going to test the oils. They're going to look for the provenance of the painting. Where is this particular painting? Where can we place it? And those are the kinds of things that I think we need to apply to New Testament studies. What can we know about this author? And how can we be sure that they have accurate information? When you actually compare the New Testament Gospels with what I call fan fiction Gospels, the ones written 200 or 300 years later,
Yep.
the New Testament Gospels have all kinds of detail. And this is something Richard Bauckham told me during an interview that I recorded with him back in 2008. All these little details help you to authenticate that this author really is from first century Palestine, and that he really was an eyewitness to the things he purports to say. All the names, all the botanical information, all of the architectural information. You mentioned like weather. In John's gospel, like he's at the portico of Solomon, and it was winter. And it just so happens that the feast he mentions, the Feast of Dedication, John chapter 10, is a winter festival. And so he puts you at the right place. The name of the portico, which we know from other sources. The culture and all these little details. All the names are in the right proportion with the right popularity ratios. And that's not stuff you can make up.
Right.
And it looks like when you see the fan fiction Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, those are, if there's any name in those texts that is not from the New Testament, it's not a first century Palestinian name. It's just like Balthazar or something like that. It just doesn't work as a fictional name. It's kind of like us trying to write a story in the 1800s. We might try to guess Gertrude and Edna would be appropriate to the period, but we certainly wouldn't get those kind of names that we try to make sound authentic, that we wouldn't get them in the right ratio and proportion.
Right. And in fact, in Baukham's book on Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he points out that popular Jewish names were different in different regions. So in Judea, there was a certain set of popular names, but if you just head down to the Jewish community in Alexandria, the popular names completely change. And so he talks about disambiguation and the need for it before we have last names, and how that disambiguation plays perfectly in the Gospels because of who gets disambiguated and why. And all of this stuff we know from then ossuary data, which a lot of people don't understand how important ossuaries are when it comes to validating the New Testament, because the use of ossuaries was a very limited amount of time in Judean history while Herod's temple was being built, and it stopped after that altogether. And so, when we find these ossuaries, the names of the people whose bones are in it are listed on the outside. They're scrawled on the outside of it. And I think of Tala Lan. She has taken the time to actually go through and catalog and put all these names together and things like this.
Yeah, 3,000 something names.
Yeah. So all of that being said, okay. So when we look at the Gospels, especially like the Gospel of Luke, are the right paints being used? Is the signature in the right place? And even the Gospel of John, is this something that we can say this is written by eyewitnesses in the first century who have intimate knowledge of Judea? And then how then does that play into your primary thesis regarding Luke's key witness, Joanna? And who is this lady anyway? And why should we even why should we be doing entire books about her?
Well, it's the basic lesson is to when you focus on the details, that background information. Jesus often hogs every scene in the New Testament, but when you actually take the time to look at some of these details, I was actually impressed. I'm not a fan of the Chosen series, but in the Chosen series, they do present Joanna as a character,
right? And
she does appear to be a wealthy, aristocratic kind of a character who's associated with Herod. And Lydia McGrew, in her book, argues that because she's associated with Herod, she probably serves as one of the key individuals who can provide us with access of what's going on in Herod's court. Because you do have in places, here's what Herod said to his servants. Well, how do disciples of Jesus know what Herod said to his servants?
Yep.
Well, Luke names one.
Yeah. I always wondered, as a pastor, when we get to, to Holy Week and things like this, we get to Passion Sunday when we're talking, when we're reading through the entire Passion narrative in the Gospels, and you have that little aside where Herod, where Pilate's wife, says, "Have nothing to do with that man. I had a terrible dream about him,
Yeah.
and let him go." That's the Roseboro paraphrase. It's like, who told the gospel writer this? Where did they get this information? And so you think you have a smoking gun here, don't you?
Well, I do. I think whatever excuse me, the thing I'm trying to state here is that there's a very, very good starting point to connect some dots, and those dots are very plausible, and they connect us not just only with this obscure character named Joanna, but also to the recipient of the Gospel of Luke, and that is Theophilus himself.
Right. Now, here's the thing. All right. So many Christians today, oh, most excellent Theophilus, and in the opening of the Gospel of Luke, to affirm and confirm the things that he had heard, right? And so he sets to pen an orderly account of what has transpired in his time. And of course, everybody loves the fact that there's a little bit of wordplay with a name like Theophilus, lover of God, a Greek name. But a lot of Christians are just not familiar with the fact that this is an actual human being, and that recent scholarship is arguing that this fellow had a very prominent position within the Jewish community after Christ's ascension. Who is this Theophilus, the most excellent one?
So I wrote an entire appendix where I sort of map out where the views have been. There, as you mentioned, there are many voices have argued Theophilus is just kind of an anonymous character. The name just means lover of God. So if you are a person who loves God, this book was written to you. Many people, I think Origen was the first to come up with that kind of theory. And there are others who throughout church history have just argued that he is an unknown Gentile ruler. And part of the reason they know it's a ruler is that you have that language of most excellent. That's kind of like the way you and I would say your excellency. The particular word in Greek is actually applied to, I believe, Festus by Paul in the in the book of Acts. So that's the governor of the region, a noble, a person. So whoever this Theophilus is, he is a person, a dignitary, a noble person, a person of weight, and probably holding some auspicious office. Okay, so that is a very good argument against the idea that Theophilus is just an anonymous person, because if you write most excellent, that doesn't really work for any person. Well, it turns out the argument that I make in my book is that there was an ossuary discovered in, I believe, 1983. A paper was written about it in 86 or so, that says to Joanna, the daughter of John, the son of Theophilus the high priest. So this makes Joanna the granddaughter of Theophilus the high priest. Josephus mentions the same Theophilus. We know there was a high priest named Theophilus who reigned from 37 to 41. Now, since the 1600s, there have been, I think, the very first person to throw out the suggestion that Luke's Theophilus was the same guy mentioned by Josephus. I think it was John Lightfoot. He threw out the possibility, and since that time, there have been, I don't know, I think I have maybe 50 of them in my book. A lot of the scholars who say this is not just a possibility, this makes the most sense, argue things like, most excellent is the thing you would say to a high priest. He was a person of nobility. That's the highest rank you can get in Israel, because they don't have kingship in Judea. You only have kingship at this time in Galilee. And that was Herod. So here in Jerusalem, the highest authority is the high priest, and he has a both political and religious office, just like everybody did in that day. In fact, I don't know if your listeners know this, but like Caesar, the Roman Caesar, one of his titles was Pontifex Maximus, the great high priest. And it's only us Westerners who think in terms of the separation of church and state. In the ancient world, every culture was rooted in some kind of cultus.
Yeah.
All right, so Theophilus, I argue, is that ossuary connects Theophilus to a Joanna. Now, the only other text that we have that connects from the first century that includes a Joanna and a Theophilus, apart from the ossuary, is the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah. Yeah, it's stunning when you consider it. And how long did it was the life of Theophilus, the high priest? How long did he live?
Well, I think if you do the math, he was probably somewhere in his 60s to 80s, and we know for sure that he no longer was alive by a reference to the last living son of Annas. Annas had 5 sons. He's the sort of the godfather high priest. In John's gospel, you have Jesus going to Annas and then to Caiaphas. He's sort of the guy in charge who isn't in charge. He has 5 sons, and all of them served as high priest. The last living one, I believe, was Annas Jr., and he ends up dying. He's dead by 67. So we know for sure, based on Josephus's comment, that Theophilus was no longer alive by 67. Probably means he died somewhere earlier in the 60s. Well, and also
go ahead.
Go ahead.
The book of Acts
also says that there's a slight delay. Sorry,
we're both excited. I think this has huge implications regarding the dating of the Gospel of Luke. Don't you?
Yeah, I do. I think so. I don't know if you know this, but who's the name just escapes me. There's a very liberal scholar who in the early 1900s, surprisingly liberal, who argued that Acts was completed by 62. And if the name comes to me, it will probably surprise you. Anyway, it's going to frustrate me now. But the thing is, a lot of scholars have recognized, Luke is in house arrest. He has not been, his trial hasn't even, we're presenting him as in house arrest, but Luke doesn't mention what happened at the end of the trial. He's exonerated in that trial, and then he goes to Spain, and then he comes back and he's beheaded. None of that is there. So why not mention this? Well, the best argument is that it hadn't happened yet. So you kind of date that Acts is sort of written, finalized by 62. Luke comes before that, and that sort of is another way to help you date the Gospel of Luke has to come before that. So. And this fits very well with that hypothesis. It seems to make a lot of sense, but a lot of modern scholars still have sort of the old way of thinking, and they think of Luke, if you're a moderate to leftist New Testament scholar, Luke was written in the 80s or 90s.
Yeah, which doesn't make a lick of sense.
Doesn't make any sense.
I think that has to do with their bias against miracles, but that's kind of the modernist liberals, but old school guys.
Exactly.
Because if you have it earlier than that, you have Jesus legitimately prophesying the destruction of the temple. And so
and Luke's version of it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is very, very clear.
Yeah, very specific. So, all right. So Theophilus is a son of Annas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is just leading to like all kinds of questions firing off in my head. So you have Luke writing a gospel to a high priest who is a son of one of the men who played an instrumental role in the crucifixion of Christ.
That might change the way you think about the Gospel of Luke now. There's a guy named John McCallus, who writes it in the 1750s, who says, essentially, this could change the way we think about Luke. It kind of becomes let's set the record straight kind of a text, maybe even an affidavit, we might say. We believe Jesus was the Messiah who was wrongly condemned by the high priesthood. Here are the facts from our side. Here are the witnesses we've interviewed. And we're going to submit it to the high priest, maybe at one of Paul's trials. Luke's gospel is associated with Paul. And also that written deposition, that written sort of exoneration, then is also distributed to the Christian community and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Now
But
I
if that's
know
the
that.
case, now you're presenting all this witness information that it's written at a time when all these things could be checked. And if they were checked and found to be falsified, that would cause huge problems for you, especially in a trial.
Yeah, yeah. I think of John Warwick Montgomery's arguments, which I think are super helpful at this point because, Montgomery had a little bit of a flair to him, a, a
That's understated.
dash, yeah, a dash and an elan to him that is. But I love being trained by Rosenblatt, who was like the astute disciple of Montgomery, and always the question would come up, when were the Gospels written? Were they written by eyewitnesses, or were they written somewhere in the 3rd century by a bunch of drunken monks trying to pass one over on people? And this idea then that the Gospel of Luke, being written to the high priest, son of Annas, who plays an instrumental role in the crucifixion of Christ, all of a sudden takes on kind of a more affidavit tone. I've heard scholars argue that he set out to write a history like Tacitus or something like this. And I can neither confirm or deny such claims. But when you put the character, who it's written to, in its proper context, all of a sudden it takes on a very different feel to the gospel itself. And I know that the book of Acts was definitely written as an affidavit and was probably presented before Caesar.
Yeah, I mean, it totally changes the way you think about the text of Luke. And just if you think about the opening prologue, it makes a lot of sense that he is doing the careful research, in touch with the eyewitnesses, that which was handed down from the beginning from those who were in touch with, who saw these things themselves, so that you, Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, can have certainty. Now, think about it this way. If Luke is just writing to an unknown Gentile ruler or this fictitious character, if there is a very well-known person in Judea up until the late 60s named Theophilus, who is most excellent, then it seems like, why go with this unknown character that we don't, we can't specify?
Yeah.
Wouldn't most of his audience automatically think of this most famous Theophilus, the one who was involved? His family was part of the one. I mean, he's the son of Annas and the brother-in-law of Caiaphas.
Yeah.
He's definitely connected to these things. So it definitely has that kind of, this changes the way we view Luke when we consider these things.
Okay. Which then begins to at least unpack some of the puzzle that your book attempts to unravel or to try to solve. And that is that Luke's key witness is Joanna. So where is she mentioned, and in what grammatical context is she mentioned?
Okay, so the first mention of her is relatively inauspicious. It's just like the place in Luke 8:3 where she's mentioned along with a couple other women who were supporting Jesus from their means. But when it describes her, she is mentioned as the Joanna, the wife of Cusa, who was the epitropos, the most translations, the steward. The ESV says household manager of Herod. Herod Antipas is the tetrarch of Galilee, which is another word for a king who, this particular king, was given a fourth the size of Herod the Great's former kingdom. All right, so when I read the word steward, I think in terms of, I'm old enough to remember before the period when flight attendants were used. We called them stewards and stewardesses, and now I don't know why that's politically incorrect to use those words. You're not supposed to anymore. But maybe because of that association, I think of a steward as like a butler.
Yeah.
And so if I see the word steward in relationship to Herod, I'm thinking, okay, it's like you would see in the Old Testament, a cupbearer. Maybe that's what's going on. And it's definitely servant class. And when I see household manager, maybe he's the guy who organizes all of the servants at the house. Who knows? Well, the word epitropos, I started doing some research here because of the ossuary. And man, it is like almost overwhelming. Every time I find this word, it's the word that describes someone like Joseph under Pharaoh. He's the
Yeah.
second in command. He
Yeah.
is the prime minister. He is the chief administrator. He is the governor. Daniel was given this term by Philo under Nebuchadnezzar, and he was given, he was second in command in all the kingdom. I found a text in Josephus where the wife of an epitropos from a neighboring kingdom was traveling in an entourage of many carriages and lots of men on horseback. So that's the kind of thing you should think about when you read about Joanna. She's in the exact same position. She's the wife of the king's governor, the king's viceroy is another way you could use this language.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And now, so if she is the kind of person who can travel in an entourage, she's a person of nobility, not from the servant class. She has definitely the ability to support Jesus out of her means. The second place she's mentioned, it's very interesting. It's at the very final chapter of Luke's Gospel, chapter 24. And I know you know this, but a lot of people don't realize that in the first century, they didn't have fluorescent yellow highlighters.
Yes. And they didn't even have bold or underlined or italics.
They didn't have italics, especially if you're writing in Italian. You just had Italian.
Right. In fact, all of the words just ran together in one long, in one long run-on sentence. So
when you wanted to emphasize something in the ancient world, they had a couple different techniques. One of them was repetition, and another technique was this kind of interesting structure where you would repeat in an A, B, C, D pattern, and the D is the centerpiece that you want to highlight, and then you back out of it. C, B, A. Okay, so the whole structure of Noah's Ark is like this, and it's like, I don't know, almost the entire Hebrew alphabet. You get to the centerpiece, and the centerpiece of that, what's called a chiasm, is God remembered Noah. And then the story backs out with all these repeating themes that it already set up.
And oftentimes they mirror each other. You got a negative at the top and a positive at the bottom. Sometimes that's how that works. Yeah.
Well, this happens in the resurrection account from the beginning of Luke chapter 24 to about verse 12. You have themes repeating in exactly the same way. In the center of this chiastic structure, there's a Mary right before Joanna, and there's a Mary right after Joanna. To give you just a simple way to look at this, the centerpiece is Joanna. She is, for some reason, being emphasized by Luke as the important witness to the empty tomb.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Let me summarize.
A couple of scholars have noted this. A couple of scholars, like Richard Bauckham, even presents the chiasm in his book Gospel Women, and John Noland in his commentary. Lots of scholars have pointed this out, but they don't know what to do with it.
Right. So let's apply Occam's razor to this because it's just so amazing. Okay. So just to kind of summarize where we're at. Okay. Joanna, the granddaughter of Theophilus. Theophilus, the son of Annas, the high priest at the time of Christ. Luke is presenting his gospel, we'll go with your thesis here, as an affidavit, a defense. This is us giving the evidence for our side of the story as Christians. And when we get to the empty tomb, the key witness at the center of the chiasm is Theophilus' granddaughter.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Everybody knows Theophilus reading this would see that chiasm and go, huh.
Yeah, and he isn't surprised. He's probably heard from inside the family that she had become a Christian. And there's an interesting reason why she became a Christian, which we could get into. But the fact is, he knows, but he's putting this in the affidavit that here is the key witness, Theophilus, is your own granddaughter, one you love and trust.
Yeah.
And this is not just for you, but this is also going to circulate widely in Christian communities, and they know it too. So this is part of the story.
Yeah. And here's the thing. This is part of the story that's lost, that you've been
Right.
able to kind of reconstruct. And all of a sudden, it adds a whole new layer of dimension and meaning to the Gospel of Luke, where, Luke, being this intelligent man that he is, who can, who interviewed all the eyewitnesses, clearly got eyewitness information from Mary herself, the mother of Christ, to fill in his nativity narrative. All of that being said, since he's writing to Theophilus, he gets to the eyewitnesses of the resurrection, and they're women, which is hilarious because they couldn't even testify in court. Okay,
Yeah.
and he makes sure to very unsubtly say, and your granddaughter is
Right.
the key
Right.
witness here. She's not just a Christian, she's an eyewitness to the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, it does sort of, and look, this is not. I mean, a lot of my thesis rests on connecting the ossuary to the Joanna that Luke mentions, and we
Yeah.
can do some work there. But the other part of this, the fact that Luke is writing to Theophilus, the high priest, is again a paradigm shift that's happening in New Testament scholarship right now. I mean,
Yeah.
your listeners can go to just type in Peter Bolt commentary of Luke. It's free at the Gospel Coalition. Peter Bolt is an Australian New Testament scholar, and it's a pretty decent commentary. And he argues that one possibility here is that this is Theophilus the high priest, and if it's Theophilus the high priest, this could be he doesn't use the word affidavit, but something close to that it's setting the record straight. And again, I mean, so that's a very popular commentary that's making that same kind of an argument. And I'm just taking it one step further, saying, if you connect the dots from, the ossuary to the reason, like I mentioned, scholars haven't really known what to do with that chiastic structure. Why is Joanna so significant in this letter? We don't even know who she is, because she's not mentioned in other texts, other gospel lessons. So she seems to be a rather insignificant character, and especially if you think the wife of Herod's steward is just a butler. But once you take the time and you do the detail work and you say, wait a minute, she is a person of nobility here as the wife of Cusa. She's a person of nobility here as the granddaughter of the high priest. What if this is the same person? I think, and I try to make the case in my book, I think that's not just a possibility. I think it's extremely plausible and the best explanation, actually.
Yeah, right. No, I think that fits there. And I would note the hoi polloi, the average blue toga. I don't know how to call these words. The average Galilean. How about that? Kind of like the Judean version of redneck. They couldn't afford an ossuary burial. Who are the people who are having their bones put in ossuaries at this time in Judea?
It's a good question. I do think that there are some discoveries. Like I wrote an article about an ossuary belonging to Alexander, the son of Simon from Cyrene. Now, what's interesting is we know of a guy named Simon from Cyrene in all three Gospels, or is it all four? It may even be four. And he's the guy that carries the cross once Jesus falls on his way to Golgotha. Mark's Gospel mentions he is the father of Alexander and Rufus. So we know the name of the city, we know the name of the man, we know the name of the man's son, and we found the name of a man named Alexander, the son of Simon from Cyrene. Well, some people have connected the dots and they've argued that this is the ossuary. It's found on the Mount of Olives. And I think they're right. And part of the way you connect the dots is by, the specificity there. It's, you multiply the odds. How many Alexanders are the son of Simon from Cyrene? And that's the kind of triangulation work I'm trying to do with this ossuary too.
Yeah.
I do think it may be more of an upper class thing to do if you have an ossuary, because they are made of stone. They have to be kind of, carved out, and they didn't allow them to be put into clay vessels. They had to be stone. Otherwise, you could have impurity.
Yeah, interesting. And so by way of comparison, okay. So in talking about this minutia, one of the examples I give is I grew up in Southern California. You and I have spent some time in Southern
Yep.
California, right? So if I asked you, do you know where La Cañada Flint Ridge is? Yeah,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, you know
I've had a
exactly.
brother who worked at a golf course in La Cañada.
La Cañada. Okay, Monrovia. You know where Monrovia is?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How about Duarte? All right.
Yes,
What
sir.
freeway do you take from Duarte down to Huntington Beach?
The 405.
Well, the 405 once you get to the bottom. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm kind of right.
Yeah, you're kind of right. And you also passed the test because you said the 405. That's a Southern California thing.
And I still do that. I still say the, and everybody looks at me strange.
I know they do that here for me in North Dakota. I say, yeah, get on the 29. I'll say, and they were, why is it the 29? Exactly. But
By the way, I know the answer to that. It's the because they used to have actual names, not numbers. It would be like the, famous Roy Rogers Freeway or something that, whatever.
Yeah.
But that changed over time. So we're the only ones that had names. And so we had the article in front of the numbers.
Right. By the way, the answer is you take the 210 to the 605.
Oh, the
south.
210.
The 210 to the 605, then the 605 to the 405. Just saying. All that being said, our ability to talk this way shows that we have local knowledge.
Right.
Absolutely, right? The average person who hasn't grown up in Southern California has never heard of Duarte, never heard of La Cañada Flint Ridge. And sadly, too many of them have never had a double animal style, but we'll pray for them.
Oh, you just put me in a place that I'm thinking about In-N-Out Burger.
My apologies. I think about it all the time.
I don't know. I've actually gone on business trips to California, and I've had it for lunch and dinner.
Yeah, I've done that too. With a tear in my eye. It's like, and I always make sure to buy the T-shirt that they're selling that year. Just like, I was so happy when they started putting them in Texas because I travel to Texas more than I do California. So, in fact, next
they have one
week
coming to Tennessee, and we're in their radius, so it could be within a decade we get one here in St. Louis.
We'll never get one here. Yeah, we can't grow any palm trees in North Dakota, so I don't think it'll work. But all that being said, we're able to talk local knowledge. We know local cuisine. We know all of this kind of stuff. That kind of detail is in the Gospels, and it's including the Gospel of John. But it's even more than that. Okay, so at the beginning of the interview, we talked about some of the circles that we've run in. Rod Rosenblatt is my mentor. We talked about John Warwick Montgomery, and we talk about these men with memory because we've had meals with them, we've had great conversations with them, we've sat at their feet and been their students, and all that being said, nobody that's been in our circle that hasn't been in our circle can smuggle their way in, claiming that that they've done it because they just don't know the people, they don't know the right names, and all that kind of stuff. What you are arguing is that kind of level of knowledge that that this didn't take place as a myth or a legend, but real human beings with real stories, with real vocations that people really knew. And this is like legitimate history, and there's intrigue, there's subtlety, there's strategy on the part of Luke on his part in putting this together to play his evidential cards really well. And then, as Montgomery always would point out, that all of this took place with plenty of time for hostile witnesses to provide a rebuttal.
Yeah.
And they don't.
Right. In fact, what you find is the opposite. You find in Acts, great crowds of priests became believers. And that's just a priest. When you actually look at just the believers in general, you have 3,000 in Acts 2. It quickly becomes 5,000. And then somewhere in the book of Acts, it says many myriads. That's tens of thousands. Many myriads of Jews became obedient to the faith. So you have this rapid expansion. If you look at the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has fame in Jerusalem and all Judea and in Samaria, and you have some scenes in which there's a group of the word myriads comes up in Luke's gospel, so that so many thousands of people were there to see him because of his fame. People were being trampled, he reports. Well, this is one of the reasons why I just think, gosh, so many New Testament scholars are basically historically tone deaf to when they argue that Jesus may have been like a fictional character. How could you make up a character who he was so famous? If you're going to make up a character, he's going to be one that, you whispered to your Aunt Martha about and only she knew. But because if you start telling the story this way, the way Luke tells the story, then everybody would know it would never get started, because everybody would laugh like that never happened. I lived in that area, the Decapolis, all these different areas, Batanea. It's just, they have all these place names where Jesus was famous. And so the fact that you have that in the Gospels exploding in the book of Acts, corroborated by texts like Clement and Tacitus. So by the 60s, both those writers talk about innumerable multitudes of Christians were rounded up and persecuted and martyred. So that was a deep, abiding faith that's the innumerable multitude were those that were captured, and they weren't willing to recant. So that's in the 60s under the Neronic persecution. So when you look at that large scope, you say, no, this is not easily explained as a myth.
Right, exactly. It'd be like somebody claiming that that Whataburger is really famous in Southern California. That's not going to work.
Not going to work.
No, it's just that didn't happen, man. Okay, Shane, I feel like we could probably talk shop for a long time, but I want people to pick up your book. So real quick, it's not currently out on Amazon. So where is the place that people can get a pre-release copy of your book right now, so that they can start reading it?
Yeah, if you want, you could just download the first couple of chapters for free. And you can just go to humbleskeptic.com. There'll be, and then check it, just click on the articles section there at the top, and you'll find an easy link it's called Luke's Key Witness, and you can download the free sample, or you could just, for a gift of any size, get the entire thing. Right now it's a pre-release because I keep finding things and I want to add to it. The goal is to finally get it done by this summer. But yeah, I find things and it's like, oh, this has to go in it, and I can never put the thing to bed.
Dude, you'll have to come up with a second edition at some point.
I hear you.
Yeah. All right. So humbleskeptic.com. We're going to put a link directly to where you can download the preview chapters in the description of this interview. And Shane, it was just great catching up with you. And I feel like that if I talk with you again, we're going to have to do this over a meal, and we can nerd out some more. But that's a whole other story.
I'm going to wear my In-N-Out Burger T-shirt as we do.
Yeah. Well, be careful, because I could always send you an email of me eating a double animal style, next week, when I'm in Austin. So.
Oh man. That would be so cruel.
I am not. That is not beneath me.
All right, it's war. When they finally build one that's near me, I'm going to drive to Nashville, and then I'm going to take pictures every time I do.
Yeah. All right, humbleskeptic.com, link to the place where you can download the preview chapters, as well as get the entire manuscript in its current form. Note that Shane is making changes along the way. For any contribution. Again, thank you, Shane. It was just a joy catching up with you, and what an amazing set of circumstances that have come up. And I love where the scholarship is going, because once again, the word of God is proven true, and that's what God's word says, is every word of God proves to be true. And you are foolish to oppose God. It's not going to work out for you, or to oppose the word of God. So All right. Thank you
thanks,
for
Chris.
your
Been a pleasure.
time, and thank you for your scholarship, sir. All right. So if you found this helpful, all the information on how you can share the video is down below in the description. And until next time, may God richly bless you in the grace and mercy won by Jesus Christ and his vicarious death on the cross for all of your sins. Amen.
So nice to see that you've made it to the end. Before you inevitably click on another video to continue binging our glorious content, you should know about some of our other offerings. First off, some of you may know that our pirate captain is also the pastor of Kongsvinger Lutheran Church out in Oslo, Minnesota. The editor that I totally don't have locked in my basement produces audio and video versions of Kongsvinger sermons and Sunday schools weekly. So go check out kongsvingerchurch.org to see all of our offerings. Now, to address some of the frequently asked questions we get in the comments. 1. The Bible and video editing software we use are named and linked in the description down below. 2. If you wish to donate to us directly so that we can keep the lights on, go check out www.piratechristian.com and hit the Crew tab. We don't promise miraculous healings or a double increase in your finances, but what we do promise is more quality discernment from our studio into your ear holes. And 3. How do you tie up with boxing gloves? Okay, who's the wiseacre who put this in here?